Good morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Okay, you're thrust into the limelight as a 17-year-old on Britain's Got Talent.
Do audiences really know the painful truth behind Jonathan Antoine, the young tenor whose golden voice first stunned the world on Britain's Got Talent? That question lingers heavily because the stage lights often reveal glamour while concealing the silent wounds that shape an artist's real life. In this report, we uncover Jonathan's heartbreaking journey, a childhood scarred by relentless bullying, the crushing weight of media scrutiny, and the silent battle with depression that nearly destroyed him. This is not just another celebrity tale, it is a human story about how the pursuit of dreams can intertwine with tragedy. But before we dive deeper into Jonathan's emotional journey, don't forget to support this channel by hitting like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring you meaningful stories like this one. As a reporter retracing Jonathan Antoine's early life in Essex, England, it quickly becomes evident that his extraordinary gift for singing emerged against a backdrop of hardship and isolation. Born into a modest family, Jonathan grew up with a body shape and appearance that made him stand out in ways that were not celebrated but ridiculed, his weight and facial features becoming constant targets of cruel mockery in the schoolyard, and those taunts left deeper scars than most observers would ever realize when later seeing him under the stage spotlight of Britain's Got Talent. Accounts from his teachers reveal that Jonathan had an exceptional vocal range at a young age, capable of reaching soaring notes with unusual power for a teenager. Yet tragically, this immense natural gift was often overshadowed by the constant barrage of insults from classmates who branded him weird or unworthy. Schoolmates later recalled that Jonathan frequently returned home with tear-stained eyes, feeling worthless, and these painful experiences pushed him to retreat into himself, becoming increasingly shy and withdrawn from the outside world. Music, however, became his sanctuary, the one place where he felt alive, where the cruelty of others dissolved, and his voice could soar above the negativity. From a journalist's perspective, this first stage of Jonathan's life was not simply about discovering a talent but about surviving relentless adversity, for his journey to the stage was already a victory over years of humiliation and pain. When audiences later marveled at his voice, they were hearing not just technique but the resilience of a young man who had endured more than his fair share of suffering. In documenting Jonathan Antoine's adolescence, one cannot avoid the overwhelming shadow of bullying that shaped much of his formative years, a period that many of his peers might remember fondly but for Jonathan was a relentless battle for dignity and self-worth. Eyewitness accounts from classmates and teachers reveal a disturbing pattern of cruelty where Jonathan's weight, voice, and introverted nature became the ammunition for endless taunts, ranging from whispered insults in hallways to overt shouts of ridicule during breaks. And these humiliations left scars that extended far beyond the classroom, infiltrating his sense of identity and confidence. Interviews with those close to him suggest that Jonathan developed a deep fear of social interaction, preferring to remain invisible in order to avoid becoming the target of another day's abuse. But ironically, this desire to hide clashed with the immense gift he carried, a voice that demanded to be heard. Yet the torment did not stop. Even when his vocal talent was recognized in small school performances, some peers dismissed him as a novelty act, mocking his size rather than celebrating his sound, and this paradoxical reality, of being exceptional yet still degraded, created a confusing psychological burden for a teenager still trying to figure out his place in the world. Experts in adolescent psychology would later observe that such prolonged bullying often leads to anxiety disorders, depressive symptoms, and self-destructive thinking, and in Jonathan's case, he admitted in later interviews that he felt broken, unworthy of attention, and terrified of stepping into the spotlight despite his abilities. As a reporter piecing this narrative together, what stands out is not only the cruelty of his peers but also the resilience Jonathan showed by continuing to sing despite the constant jeers, finding in music a fragile refuge that offered him both escape and empowerment. It was in those lonely hours, rehearsing arias and letting his voice reverberate through his bedroom walls, that Jonathan slowly began to reclaim a sense of identity, one that would later shock the world when he finally stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, turning years of silent suffering into a powerful statement of survival. When Jonathan Antoine finally stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in 2012 alongside his then-singing partner Charlotte Jaconelli, few in the audience could have predicted the storm of emotion and astonishment that was about to unfold. For in that moment the world witnessed not only an extraordinary vocal performance but also the shattering of preconceived judgments built on appearance and stereotype. Reporters covering the show at the time noted how initial reactions from judges and spectators were tinged with skepticism, some even smirking at Jonathan's nervous demeanor and unconventional image. Yet the second he opened his mouth and released the first powerful notes of the prayer, the atmosphere shifted dramatically, as if the entire theater had been struck by an invisible force, silencing doubters and compelling the audience to rise to their feet. From a journalistic perspective, the performance was not merely impressive, it was transformative, illustrating how talent and authenticity can pierce through layers of prejudice in ways words never could. And within minutes, Jonathan's name was trending across the United Kingdom, his story spreading rapidly through television highlights, newspaper features, and viral social media clips. But what many did not realize at the time was that while Jonathan's voice soared, his inner battles raged quietly beneath the surface. For even amid thunderous applause, he struggled to process the sudden surge of attention, his years of insecurity clashing with the overwhelming validation of millions of strangers. Producers who worked behind the scenes described Jonathan as visibly shaken after the performance, needing reassurance from Charlotte and staff to calm his nerves, while critics who initially doubted him now scrambled to praise him as the new Pavarotti, a label that, though flattering, added another layer of pressure onto the shoulders of a teenager still grappling with self-esteem. The Britain's Got Talent audition became a cultural touchstone, an example used in countless articles and broadcasts about overcoming adversity, yet for Jonathan himself, it was both a triumph and the beginning of a new chapter of challenges, for with fame came scrutiny, with recognition came expectation, and with every cheer came the haunting echo of past bullying that whispered he might still never be good enough. From a reporter's vantage point, this was the pivotal juncture where Jonathan Antoine ceased to be a local boy with a remarkable voice and instead became a national symbol of resilience, a young man thrust into the spotlight who would soon discover that the glare of fame can both heal and wound in equal measure. In the weeks following Jonathan Antoine's explosive audition on Britain's Got Talent, the media spotlight intensified to a degree that few teenagers could withstand, and as reporters covering the story at the time observed, the narrative surrounding Jonathan quickly split into two contrasting streams. One that celebrated his prodigious talent and painted him as the embodiment of "don't judge a book by its cover," and another, far less kind, that continued to fixate on his physical appearance, perpetuating the same cruel judgments that had haunted him throughout childhood. Headlines alternated between glowing praise of his angelic voice and tasteless remarks about his weight, creating a paradoxical environment where Jonathan was simultaneously lauded as a national treasure and degraded as a spectacle. And this dichotomy placed enormous psychological strain on a teenager already carrying fragile self-confidence. Journalists who attempted to interview him behind the scenes noted how Jonathan appeared overwhelmed, often hiding behind Charlotte Jaconelli during press interactions, speaking softly and nervously tugging at his clothes as if trying to disappear, a visual reminder that the world had fallen in love with his voice but still judged the body that carried it. Social media further amplified these pressures, with viral clips spreading globally, introducing Jonathan to millions but also exposing him to a relentless barrage of online comments, some supportive and inspirational, others cruel and merciless, and the sheer volume of attention left him struggling to reconcile the reality of who he was with the public image being constructed around him. Psychologists later remarked that such a sudden transition, from bullied teenager to global sensation, could be destabilizing for even the most emotionally grounded adult, let alone a young man still navigating adolescence, and the weight of expectation that followed, with media outlets calling him the next Pavarotti, and fans demanding more from him with every performance, only compounded his internal struggles. As a reporter reflecting on this chapter, it becomes clear that Jonathan's story was not just one of triumph but also of collision, where fame's dazzling promise collided head-on with the painful insecurities of a boy who never expected the world to be watching so closely. And while audiences celebrated his talent, Jonathan was left to quietly shoulder the burden of balancing adoration with anxiety, a task that would grow heavier with every headline and every critical eye trained upon him. As the months passed after his Britain's Got Talent breakthrough, Jonathan Antoine's radiant voice became a staple of television recaps, news features, and fan discussions. But behind the stage curtain and away from cameras, he was quietly fighting a battle few audiences suspected, carrying emotional scars that no standing ovation could erase. According to those close to him at the time, Jonathan's anxiety intensified under the weight of sudden fame, and while the public saw a young star seemingly living out a dream, the reality was that he often returned home feeling drained, doubting himself, and replaying in his mind every cruel word ever hurled at him during his school years. Mental health experts point out that this type of internalized bullying, when paired with the overwhelming expectations of celebrity, can trigger depressive spirals, and Jonathan later admitted in candid interviews that he felt broken, that the applause seemed unreal, and that he often wondered if People only loved his voice but would never truly accept him as a person. He described waking up some mornings with little motivation to leave bed, caught between the demands of a growing fan base and his own gnawing insecurities, a conflict that underscores how success in the public eye does not erase private suffering. From a journalist's standpoint, it was striking to observe how Jonathan's image in the media remained so positive while whispers circulated backstage about his fragile state, with staff members sometimes shielding him from particularly harsh press clippings to protect his mental health. Charlotte Jaconelli, his singing partner at the time, also played a protective role, often stepping in to deflect uncomfortable questions or reassure him when he grew visibly distressed in interviews. And yet, despite these safety nets, Jonathan's battle with self-esteem grew more complicated as the gap widened between the public's perception of a rising tenor sensation and his own sense of inadequacy. What makes this chapter so poignant is the duality. Jonathan could stand on stage and deliver a performance that silenced thousands, yet moments later retreat into himself, questioning whether he truly deserved the applause, and that contradiction reveals the deep emotional scars he carried, scars invisible to fans but painfully real to him, shaping the tragic undercurrent of a career that seemed destined for joy but was shadowed by lingering trauma. One of the most defining aspects of Jonathan Antoine's early rise to fame was his partnership with Charlotte Jaconelli, a collaboration that began as a school assignment and evolved into a musical duo that captivated millions on Britain's Got Talent. Yet while their on-stage chemistry seemed flawless, the relationship behind the curtain carried complexities that reveal much about Jonathan's journey. As reporters covering their progress at the time observed, Charlotte often acted as Jonathan's anchor during interviews and public appearances, her extroverted confidence balancing his shy and anxious demeanor, and it was clear to many that she provided not only vocal harmony but also emotional stability. Judges and critics frequently praised their complementary talents, describing Jonathan as the powerhouse tenor and Charlotte as the grounding force who helped him navigate the overwhelming spotlight. But as their fame grew, so did speculation about whether they would continue as a duo or pursue separate careers, a question that placed subtle tension on their dynamic. Eventually, after signing with Simon Cowell's record label and releasing their debut album, decisions were made that led to their parting ways, with Jonathan moving toward a solo career while Charlotte pursued her own musical path. And though both publicly stated the split was amicable, sources close to them hinted that Jonathan struggled emotionally with the separation, feeling as though he had lost a vital source of reassurance at a time when he needed it most. From a journalist's perspective, this chapter underscores how intertwined personal and professional lives can become in the world of entertainment, particularly for young performers still grappling with identity and confidence. And losing Charlotte as a partner not only altered Jonathan's musical trajectory but also removed a figure who had often shielded him from the harsher edges of fame. Fans, too, expressed sadness at the dissolution of the duo, many writing letters and online posts lamenting the loss of a partnership that symbolized harmony both musically and emotionally, and this public reaction further complicated Jonathan's feelings, as he admitted later that he worried people only accepted him as part of Jonathan and Charlotte, rather than as an artist in his own right. The separation was not a scandal but a professional decision, yet for Jonathan it marked another moment of vulnerability, forcing him to confront his insecurities without the comfort of someone who had become, in many ways, his stage shield, and it highlighted once again the fragile balance between triumph and tragedy that defined his early career. When Jonathan Antoine embarked on his solo career following the amicable split from Charlotte Jaconelli, the transition marked both an exciting new chapter and a daunting challenge that would test his resilience in unprecedented ways. For while industry insiders and fans alike expected him to flourish as a solo artist, the absence of Charlotte's steadying presence meant Jonathan had to face the stage, the cameras, and the critics without the protective buffer he had once relied upon. Reporters following his journey noted the stark contrast between the soaring grandeur of his music and the internal doubts that continued to plague him, as he struggled to reconcile the overwhelming praise of producers and fans with his own persistent sense of inadequacy. His early solo releases showcased the extraordinary tenor voice that had captured Britain's attention, albums that debuted to critical acclaim and commercial success. Yet behind the headlines of triumph there lingered a quieter story of a young man grappling with loneliness and pressure, feeling at times as though the weight of expectation was suffocating. Music journalists who interviewed him during this period often described Jonathan as humble to the point of self-effacement, sometimes apologizing unnecessarily for small mistakes in rehearsal. And while this humility endeared him to many, it also highlighted a lingering fragility, a reminder that his mental health remained as much a part of his narrative as his music. The demands of touring added further strain, as Jonathan was thrust into a schedule that required stamina, confidence, and constant public visibility, elements that clashed with his natural introversion and ongoing battle with anxiety. While his voice soared in concert halls, backstage he often retreated into silence, conserving energy not just for performance but for coping with the emotional toll of being perpetually in the spotlight. From a reporter's perspective, Jonathan's solo career was a paradox. Professionally, it was proof that he could stand alone as a world-class tenor, yet personally, it exposed the vulnerabilities that had always been present, making every achievement a double-edged sword. He was no longer half of a duo but a singular artist expected to carry the weight of an entire career on his own, and while the public cheered, Jonathan continued to navigate the shadows of insecurity and self-doubt, his journey illustrating that the transition from promising contestant to solo star is rarely as seamless as headlines make it appear, especially for someone whose personal struggles run as deep as his vocal talent. As Jonathan Antoine's solo career unfolded and his albums reached eager audiences, another story ran parallel behind the curtain, one that reporters only began to piece together later when Jonathan himself chose to speak openly about it. His ongoing struggle with depression, a silent adversary that shadowed even his most celebrated accomplishments. In interviews, he confessed that there were mornings when he found it difficult to summon the will to get out of bed, when the thought of performing before thousands felt insurmountable, and when the applause that thundered through grand concert halls seemed hollow compared to the weight pressing on his chest. Mental health experts who later analyzed his candid admissions emphasized how the abrupt transition from bullied teenager to international star could destabilize even the strongest psyche. And in Jonathan's case, the contrast between external adoration and internal turmoil became almost unbearable, amplifying feelings of imposter syndrome and self-doubt. Friends and colleagues described periods where Jonathan would withdraw from social contact, preferring isolation, and while to the outside world he remained the same golden-voiced tenor, behind closed doors he wrestled with darkness that few could comprehend. The irony, as many journalists noted, was that Jonathan's music often carried themes of hope, transcendence, and beauty, even as the artist himself was struggling to hold onto those very sentiments in his personal life. Public reaction to his openness about depression was largely compassionate, with fans flooding social media with messages of support, thanking him for his honesty and sharing their own battles with mental illness, a response that underscored how Jonathan's vulnerability resonated as deeply as his voice. Yet the pressure remained because every new album, every concert, every interview still came with the expectation that he would not only deliver perfection vocally but also embody the image of a triumphant survivor, a role that, while inspiring, was exhausting to maintain. From a reporter's perspective, Jonathan's admission of depression reframed his story entirely, shifting it from a narrative of simple triumph to one of complex humanity, a reminder that behind every flawless note lies a person grappling with flaws, fears, and fragility. And in Jonathan's case, the tragedy was not that he struggled, but that his struggle played out in the shadows while the world saw only light, making his bravery and eventually sharing his pain not just cathartic for him but transformative for countless fans who saw in his honesty a mirror of their own hidden battles. After weathering the storms of depression and self-doubt, Jonathan Antoine's eventual return to the stage with a renewed sense of strength marked a pivotal chapter in his narrative, one that reporters covering his career identified as both a comeback and a personal rebirth. It was not that Jonathan had ever disappeared. His voice had continued to resonate through recordings and sporadic performances, but rather that his re-emergence carried a different energy, a maturity forged through pain, therapy, and reflection. In interviews during this period, Jonathan spoke more openly about his mental health struggles, and his candor struck a chord with fans and journalists alike, demonstrating that his artistry was no longer defined solely by technical mastery but by authenticity and vulnerability. Audiences who flocked to his concerts in this new era described not only the familiar power of his tenor voice but also an intangible shift in presence, a performer who seemed more grounded, more accepting of himself, and more willing to share the emotional depth behind each lyric. Critics noted that his interpretations of classical pieces and ballads carried a rawer emotional weight, as though he was channeling his lived experiences into every phrase, and in doing so, he transformed performances into cathartic journeys for both himself and his listeners. Yet even as he embraced this newfound resilience, Jonathan remained humble about his progress, often reminding interviewers that healing was not linear, that bad days still came, but that he had learned coping mechanisms and built a stronger support system around him. From a journalist's perspective, this chapter revealed a striking contrast to the trembling teenager once shielded by Charlotte Jaconelli on Britain's Got Talent. For now Jonathan stood more firmly on his own, not invincible but undeniably stronger. His return was not simply about reclaiming a place in the spotlight but about reclaiming himself, showing that tragedy does not define the end of a story but can instead carve a deeper, more resonant path forward. And in Jonathan's case, his renewed strength illuminated both the fragility and the resilience that make his journey profoundly human. As a reporter reflecting on Jonathan Antoine's journey from a bullied schoolboy to a celebrated tenor who has openly confronted his deepest struggles, the lessons embedded in his story are both sobering and inspiring, offering a mirror not only to the entertainment industry but also to society's treatment of vulnerability and difference. Jonathan's trajectory reminds us that extraordinary talent does not shield a person from pain, that behind the flawless notes and standing ovations often lies a fragile human being navigating insecurities, traumas, and pressures invisible to the cheering crowd. His life underscores how easy it is for audiences and media alike to consume the triumph without acknowledging the tragedy, to celebrate the spectacle while overlooking the scars that enable such authenticity to exist. For those who followed his career closely, the real story was not just about a young man with a voice compared to Pavarotti, but about a survivor who turned bullying, ridicule, and depression into fuel for artistic expression, making his performances resonate not because they were perfect but because they were profoundly human. The lesson here extends far beyond music, reminding us to reconsider how we judge others, how quickly we form assumptions based on appearance, and how often we fail to see the battles people fight behind closed doors. Jonathan's honesty in sharing his struggles with mental health has opened conversations that extend well beyond his fan base, giving courage to others who suffer silently, proving that vulnerability is not weakness but strength. From a journalist's perspective, the most heartbreaking aspect of Jonathan's tragedy is also its most powerful truth, that his story encapsulates both the cruelty of a world quick to judge and the resilience of an individual determined to rise above it. And in that duality lies a universal lesson, that compassion, patience, and empathy must accompany applause because without them we risk celebrating an artist while neglecting the person within. Ultimately, Jonathan Antoine's story is not only a testament to the healing power of music but also a call to audiences everywhere to look beyond the stage lights, to honor not just the voice but the journey, and to understand that behind every triumph, there may be a tragedy that deserves to be heard with equal reverence.